During his most recent episode of The Daily Show, Jon Stewart makes a passionate and compelling case that the MAGA movement is inherently and anti-American, and Republicans have forfeited their right to call themselves the party of patriotism. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, I've got one clip. I've got a few clips to show you, but only one clip of the Jon Stewart conversation because the entire thing is if you play too much of Jon Stewart, it's potentially copyrighted, so I can't play it all. But I want to play the summation here because it's so powerful. This is after like a 10 to 15 minute screed by Jon Stewart, making the case that even though Republicans continue to lie, suggesting that they're the pro-America, pro-patriot party, they're actually not, because they're an authoritarian cult of personality. We're going to play this clip and unpack the rest of it and its implications together.
If you want to love Trump, love him. Go to the rallies, buy the sneakers. You want to give him absolute power? You want him to be the leader uber alles? You want him to have the right of kings? You do you. But stop framing it as patriotism. Because the one thing you cannot say is that Donald Trump is following the tradition of the founders. He is advocating for complete and total presidential immunity. His words, not mine. That is monarchy shit. And it's your right to support it. But just do me a favor for historical accuracy. Next time you want to dress up at the rallies, wear the right colored coats.
It's a great episode. It's a great monologue. You should definitely check it out. But he's making the case that effectively that for all intents and purposes, the MAGA movement are the inheritors, the heirs of the redcoats, the British redcoats, the monarchists, because they are effectively advocating for a monarch who is above the Constitution, not just federal law, the Constitution, in terms of what they support for Donald Trump. And we have evidence to prove that in terms of what Trump supporters want. But so I actually want to also read excerpts from an article from the Brennan Institute in which they interview founding era historians about Donald Trump's relationship with power and his claims to monarchy, because this is something that I've talked about before, that Donald Trump's claims of absolute presidential immunity are a de facto form of monarchy. See, in the United Kingdom, the British monarch is literally by constitutional convention above the law, because the monarch is the source of law as far as the British constitutional monarchy is concerned, right? That's why they refer to it as the crown or the sovereign, right? Everything flows from the sitting monarch, at least in theory. And we're supposed to have the exact opposite of that in our democratic constitutional republic. So with that in mind, I'm going to read some excerpts here from this article. So the interviewer says Trump argues that he can't be prosecuted for actions he undertook when he was president. What would the framers have thought of this claim? And this, the first historian, Rosemary Zagari, says it's highly unlikely the founding generation would have believed that a former president was immune from punishment for committing crimes, especially the kind of crimes that Trump is accused of committing. One of the defining features of a constitutional government is that all people, whatever their station or office, must be subject to the same laws. As Thomas Paine said in Common Sense, in America, the law is king. As in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king. Trump is attempting to act as a king above the law. Alexander Conti Hansen of Maryland, writing as Aristides, was confident that any president who engaged in bribery, corruption, or other crimes would have to face the legal consequences of his action. Like every other individual, Hansen said, he is liable to punishment. In contrast to a monarch, the president, according to Alexander Hamilton, is not sacred and inviolable. Hamilton said that the president is as much subject to punishment as corrupt governors from states such as New York, Maryland, and Delaware were at the time of the founding. And again, they go on like that. Accordingly, he should be liable for his actions. It's ludicrous to argue, as Trump does, that subverting the very system of constitutional government that the president is charged with upholding is something that the president can do legally. Holly Brewer, the other person who was interviewed, another founding era historian, said there was broad agreement among the founders that presidents should be held accountable for their actions. One form of accountability is impeachment and removal by Congress, but the framers didn't design impeachment to be an exclusive remedy, preempting criminal prosecution. No doubt the framers would have thought that impeachment would make prosecution easier because it would be difficult, no matter the circumstances, to prosecute someone in a position of power. But the framers envisioned prosecution as an ever-present possibility. Okay. And the founders would have certainly deemed any action taken to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power and to lengthen one's term as president to be a prosecutable offense. Again, this is according to founding era historians. Another question. Trump suggests that the Constitution granted American presidents the same powers and immunities that the British king had. Is he right? Holly Brewer says the framers were keenly aware of the dangers of a king, and they designed Article 2 to draw strong contrast with the British monarchy, where the king maintained uncheckable royal prerogatives. The president had a narrowly prescribed set of powers, or circumscribed set of powers, and no king-like immunity from the legal process in the courts. Consider a few of the many provisions of Article 2 that limits the president's power. Again, they go in the contrast. Unlike a king, the president's supposed to be elected. Unlike a king, the president was given no absolute veto over the legislature. Unlike a king, the president was given no power to simply dismiss the legislature. Unlike a king, the president was given no power to unilaterally declare war or make treaties into law, etc., and so forth. Also, at the Philadelphia Convention 1787, one of the most divisive issues, according to Zagari here, the framers had was determining the nature of the executive branch. And she goes into examples about how, and we've talked about this in previous videos, how during the Constitutional Convention, the founders struggled. Should power be expressed by one chief executive or a council of chief executives? Should the chief executive be effectively a prime minister appointed by the legislature? There were serious questions about it. I would argue there were more, concentrated concerns and questions about the chief executive than any other officer or member of government. Another question. Is there any other big picture context that would help us understand how the founding generation saw the president's powers that would be relevant to the immunity question? Holly Brewer says, again, as we've both noted, the framers wanted to make sure there were limits, on the president's powers so that he could not become a tyrant or permanent ruler. I don't think we should forget that the Declaration of Independence has a founding era precedent for judging when a leader had crossed that line. It argued that revolution against George III was legitimate after a long train of abuses. That's a good basic standard for how the framers might have understood when it came to appropriate to remove and prosecute a president. And then also, as we've discussed in previous videos, there's questions about the precedent established by our first president and our most important founding father, George Washington. How does George Washington's early example inform our understanding of the powers of the president? And both Zagari and Brewster go into vivid detail about so many of the anxieties associated with the founders pertaining to crafting the office of the presidency were somewhat tempered because they had absolute trust that a statesman like George Washington would help fill in the gaps and help set the precedent. So they were extremely nervous about this. And there was a reason that George Washington was a unanimous consideration. He won in both terms, unanimous vote in terms of electoral votes to become president in his first and second term. That's how much faith they had in George Washington, which in and of itself was a risk. But as Brewster and Zagari point out, Washington set the precedent by resigning his commission at the end of the French and Indian War, resigning his commission at the end of the American Revolution, where he was effectively, at that time, he was poised to be a dictator, right? Because the Continental Congress, gave all the military power to George Washington. He was in command of the Continental Army. He had just beaten the British, and monarchy was all the world had known at the time, at least the then modern world. So it would have been entirely commensurate with history for George Washington to declare himself dictator. But he didn't. He resigned his commission. He basically had Congress by the throat. He could have, killed them. He could have imprisoned them. He could have declared himself dictator for life. And instead, with all the power in his hand, he gave it up. He renounced his commission. He even didn't want to be president. He didn't want to be president for a second term. They convinced him into doing it, and he set the precedent. And George Washington is a wildly different person, or was a wildly different person, than Donald Trump. And so this interview, you should definitely check it out, and I'll link it in the description in this video. But they explain that it is profoundly un-American, it's profoundly anti-American, it's profoundly anti-founding father to suggest that the president of the United States is a de facto monarch, that they're entitled to these sort of ludicrous, lifelong, absolute immunities. That's insane. We grant certain powers for a limited amount of time with checks and balances, certain considerations, certain privileges to the sitting president, and then they go away because you have to leave office, and then you return to the citizenry. So that's the way we should look at it. But MAGA has a different approach. Like, I want to play a couple of clips. This is what MAGA believes with respect to Donald Trump's relationship with the Constitution.
Hey, Okay, how many people here, now normally I know you probably wouldn't in America, but considering what they've done to this man, how many people here support day one dictator?
Folks, you have MAGA people cheering the notion of Donald Trump being a dictator. It's not just at that rally, it's in multiple rallies.
Would you rather have 4 years of Donald Trump as a dictator or 4 years of President Biden reelected?
You know, you don't have to like the words that come out of the man's mouth, but sometimes in life we all need a good paddling from the principal to set our life on the right track. And this country does need a little bit of that. We need a little paddling. I mean, I was a problem child growing up, and it took a good leadership to set me straight. So I think our country does need some of that. So I hands down believe people wanted it 4 years ago, 3 years ago. So,
But they didn't vote that way, right?
I don't know about that.
You think it was a stolen election?
Without a doubt.
The other day, Donald Trump said on his first day he's going to be a dictator for a day.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
Folks, it's deranged. It is deranged. So Jon Stewart is absolutely correct. Listen, you can say what you want, right? There's nothing literally preventing you from speaking. But the rest of us should categorically and vociferously, passionately reject the argument that the Republican Party are the heirs of the founding fathers, that they are the party of patriots, that MAGA is a patriotic party. They're not. MAGA is an authoritarian cult of personality, which deserves nothing but contempt in terms of its leaders, and pity in terms of its cult following. The Republican Party, Republican thought leaders, conservative thought leaders, also, they deserve nothing but contempt because they are an un-American, anti-American party. When you appoint somebody and try to anoint somebody above the Constitution, by definition, you are and anti-American. And those of us who are anti-GOP, those of us who are liberals, leftists, progressives, we need to reclaim the mantle of patriotism because MAGA and Republicans, well, MAGA never had it and Republicans forfeited it. Let me know what you think in the comments.